On Christmas Eve in my Boulder home, after handing my son Gary a check to pay off his entire mortgage and gifting his wife Sherry a designer purse, I waited for that moment of connection, anything that showed I still mattered to them. Instead, my son pushed the check away and said, "No gifts for you, Mom. You need to learn a lesson." Sherry sat back with a satisfied smirk, completely unaware that I had a black envelope in my apron, and I had come prepared to teach a lesson of my own. They say a mother knows when something is wrong with her child, but I think it's deeper than that. A mother knows when she is losing her child entirely. I stood in the center of my kitchen in Boulder, Colorado. The house smelled the way it always did on Christmas Eve: rosemary, roasting beef, and the sharp, piney scent of the tree in the living room. Everything was perfect. I had polished the silver until my knuckles ached. I had ironed the good linens, the ones I only brought out for special occasions. Outside, the snow was falling softly against the window pane, covering the driveway in a clean, white blanket. It looked like a greeting card, but my hands were shaking. I wasn't looking at the roast in the oven. I wasn't checking the time on the microwave. I was staring at the black envelope sitting on the Marble Island counter. It looked so out of place next to the bowl of cranberries and the tray of cookies. It was dark, heavy, and terrifying. I had spent the last 3 days praying I wouldn't have to open it. I prayed that my intuition was wrong. I prayed that tonight would just be a nice family dinner, the kind we used to have before Gary met Sherry. I wanted to believe that my son was still the boy I raised, the boy who used to shovel the neighbors' driveways for free, the boy who would call me every Sunday just to hear my voice. But deep down, in the pit of my stomach, I knew that boy was gone. I took a deep breath and smoothed the front of my apron. I had worked so hard for this night. I had spent months scraping together my savings, sacrificing my own comforts just to help them. I knew Gary was struggling. I knew the debt was keeping him awake at night. I wanted to be the one to lift that burden off his shoulders. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We fix things. We clean up the messes. We give until there is nothing left to give. But lately, it felt like my giving was just disappearing into a black hole. I walked over to the window and looked out at the driveway. Headlights cut through the snowy darkness. They were here. My heart did a nervous flutter, a mix of excitement and dread. I should have been overjoyed. My son was home for Christmas, but instead, I felt like a soldier preparing for a battle I didn't want to fight. I looked back at that black envelope. "Please, Gary," I whispered to the empty room. "Please just be my son tonight. Don't make me do this." I didn't want to be right. I wanted to be a paranoid old woman who was imagining things. I wanted to throw that envelope in the trash and never think about it again. But then I remembered the phone call I had overheard 3 weeks ago. I remembered the way Sherry had looked at me the last time they visited, like I was an expired carton of milk sitting on a shelf she wanted to clear. The car doors slammed outside. I heard the muffled sound of voices. They were arguing. Even on Christmas Eve, walking up the path to his mother's house, they were bickering. I quickly grabbed the black envelope. The paper felt thick and cold against my fingers. I folded it once and slipped it deep into the pocket of my apron, right underneath my handkerchief. It sat there like a lead weight against my hip. I patted it once, just to make sure it was hidden. It was my insurance policy. It was the truth I hoped I wouldn't have to speak. The doorbell rang. It wasn't a cheerful ring. It was a sharp, demanding buzz. I forced a smile onto my face, the same smile I had worn for 40 years of hosting holidays. I unlocked the front door and swung it open, letting the cold air rush in. "Merry Christmas," I said, opening my arms. Gary walked in first. He looked tired. His coat was wet with snow, and his eyes didn't meet mine. He looked past me, toward the warmth of the living room. "Hey, Mom," he mumbled. He gave me a quick, one-armed hug, barely squeezing back. It felt like hugging a stranger. He pulled away too fast, rubbing his hands together as he walked past me. Then came Sherry. She didn't hug me. She didn't even take off her gloves immediately. She stood in the entryway, shaking the snow off her expensive boots onto my hardwood floor. She looked me up and down, her eyes critical, scanning my outfit like she was trying to guess how much it cost. "Hello, Roseanne," she said. Her voice was tight, high-pitched. "It's freezing in here. Do you have the heat on?" "It's set to 72, just like always," I said, closing the door behind them. "Come in, take your coats off. Dinner is almost ready." Sherry didn't move toward the kitchen to help. Instead, she walked slowly into the living room. I watched her from the hallway. She wasn't looking at the Christmas tree or the family photos on the mantel. She was looking at the furniture. She ran a gloved hand along the back of my antique armchair. She tapped her fingernail against the glass of the china cabinet. She looked up at the crown molding. It wasn't the look of a guest admiring a home. It was the look of an appraiser calculating the value of an estate. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. My hand went instinctively to my apron pocket, clutching the edge of the hidden envelope. Gary was already pouring himself a drink at the sideboard, his back to me. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about his father's grave. He didn't ask if I needed help in the kitchen. He just took, and Sherry just calculated. I stood there in the hallway for a second, watching them. They were in my house, eating my food, warming themselves by my fire, yet I had never felt more invisible. The hope I had held on to, the hope that the check I had written for them would fix everything, started to crack. I took a breath, stiffened my spine, and walked into the room. If they thought I was just a senile old woman they could walk over, they were wrong. I loved them, but I wasn't blind. "I hope you're hungry," I said, my voice steady. "I made your favorite, Gary." He didn't turn around. "Sure, Mom. Whatever." I squeezed the envelope in my pocket one last time. "I hope you don't make me do this, Gary." Dinner was supposed to be the highlight of the evening. I had set the table with the good china, the pieces with the gold rim that my mother had left me. I lit the candles in the center of the table, hoping the soft light would make the atmosphere warmer, maybe hide the wrinkles of worry on my face. But as we sat there, the silence was so heavy you could almost hear the snow falling outside. The only sounds in the room were the scraping of silverware against porcelain and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Gary was eating, but he wasn't tasting anything. He was shoveling the roast beef and potatoes into his mouth, like he just wanted to get it over with. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on his plate, or he would glance over at Sherry as if checking for permission to speak. Sherry, on the other hand, wasn't eating much. She was too busy looking around the room. Her eyes darted from the heavy oak sideboard to the crystal chandelier above us. It made my skin crawl. It felt less like a family dinner and more like an open house inspection. "You know, Roseanne," Sherry said, breaking the silence. She didn't look at me. She was staring at the buffet table. "This furniture is really bulky. It makes the room feel so small." I set my fork down gently. "It's solid oak, Sherry. Gary's father and I bought that piece for our 5th anniversary. It's supposed to be substantial." Sherry smirked, taking a tiny sip of wine. "Well, substantial is one word for it. Dated is another. You know, open concepts are the thing now. If you got rid of all this heavy, dark wood, you could really open the space up. It would increase the resale value." My stomach tightened. There it was. The resale value. "I'm not planning on selling, Sherry," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I plan on living here for a long time." Sherry exchanged a quick look with Gary. It was a look that said, "See, She's being difficult. Of course, she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. But you have to be practical. The market in Boulder is exploding right now. A house this size, on this much land, you're sitting on a gold mine. It's almost selfish to hoard it all for one person, don't you think? I looked at Gary, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to say, Sherry, leave Mom alone. She loves this house. But he just chewed his roast beef, staring at the tablecloth. It's a lot of upkeep, Mom. Gary finally mumbled, not meeting my eyes. Sherry's just thinking about what's best for you. The stairs, the snow shoveling, it's a lot for a woman your age. I managed just fine, I said, perhaps a little too sharply. I took a breath. I didn't want to argue. I wanted to fix this. I had a plan. I had the gifts. I decided to change the subject before I lost my temper. I wanted to show them that I was on their team. I wanted to show them that I supported them, even if they didn't seem to support me. Let's not talk about real estate on Christmas Eve, I said, forcing a smile. I have something for you both. I couldn't wait until tomorrow morning. I stood up and walked over to the sideboard. My heart was pounding again. I reached for the 2 gift bags I had hidden there. One was a glossy red bag with gold tissue paper. The other was a simple white envelope. I handed the red bag to Sherry first. Merry Christmas, Sherry. She took it with a raised eyebrow, barely wiping her mouth with her napkin. She pulled out the tissue paper and lifted out the purse. It was a designer bag, genuine leather, the brand she had been obsessing over on Facebook for months. It cost me 3 months of my pension, but I wanted to make peace. She looked at it, turned it over in her hands, and then set it on the floor next to her chair. Thanks, Roseanne. It's a nice color. That was it. No, I love it. No, you shouldn't have. Just, it's a nice color. I swallowed the lump in my throat. It didn't matter. The real gift was for Gary. This was the one that would change everything. This was the one that would prove I was a good mother. I walked over to Gary and placed the white envelope on the placemat right in front of him. My hand lingered on it for a second. Gary, I said softly, I know things have been tight for you too. I know you've been worried about the balloon payment coming up on your mortgage. I've been saving for a while, and I moved some things around. He looked at the envelope, then up at me. There was confusion in his eyes, but no warmth. Go ahead, I urged him. Open it. Inside was a cashier's check for $40,000. It was everything I had in my liquid savings. It was my safety net. But I was willing to cut my net to build him a bridge. Gary didn't open it. He looked at Sherry. She gave him a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. A signal. Gary put his hand on the envelope. He didn't pick it up. He just slid it across the tablecloth, pushing it back toward me until it hit my water glass with a soft clink. The room went dead silent. I don't want it, Gary said. His voice was flat, robotic. I blinked, confused. Gary, it's not a loan. It's a gift. It pays off the debt. You can start fresh. He looked up at me then, and for the first time that night, I saw real emotion in his eyes. But it wasn't gratitude. It was anger. Cold, hard anger. I said I don't want it. He snapped. No gifts for you, Mom. Not this year. I felt like I had been slapped. What? Gary, what are you talking about? He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, mimicking the defensive posture his wife was holding. You think you can just buy us off? You think money fixes how you treat people. Treat people. I stammered. I've done nothing but love you. You need to learn a lesson, Gary said. The words hung in the air, toxic and cruel. You need to learn that you can't just do whatever you want and expect us to come running just because you wave a check around. Sherry told me everything, Mom. We're done taking your handouts. Sherry smiled. It was a small, victorious little smirk, aimed right at her wine glass. She was enjoying this. She was enjoying seeing my son humiliate me at my own table. For a moment, I wanted to cry. The tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. I felt old, foolish, and rejected. I looked at the check sitting there, my life's savings treated like garbage. But then I looked at Sherry's smirk. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was the quiet click of a lock turning. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, clarifying heat. They think I'm weak, I thought. They think I'm a desperate old woman who will beg for their attention. I stopped trembling. My breathing steadied. I looked at Gary, really looked at him. He was a grown man acting like a petulant child, and he had just refused the biggest blessing I could give him. I didn't say a word. I reached out and picked up the envelope. I opened the flap slowly, deliberately. I pulled out the check. The blue security paper crinkled in the silence. "You're right, Gary," I said. My voice was completely steady. It didn't shake. It didn't crack. I do need to learn a lesson. I held the check up between my thumbs and forefingers, right at eye level, so they both had to look at it. And I think I just learned it. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet dining room. I tore the check right down the middle. Sherry's eyes went wide. Her jaw actually dropped. Gary flinched as if I had thrown hot water on him. "Mom," he gasped, half standing up. "What are you doing?" I put the two halves together and ripped them again and again until $40,000 was nothing but blue confetti in my hand. I let the pieces flutter down onto his empty dinner plate. "Lesson learned," I said, picking up my wine glass and taking a sip. "Now pass the salt, please." The pile of blue paper scraps sat on the white porcelain plate like a little mountain of regret. For a long time, nobody moved. The only sound in the room was Gary's heavy breathing. He was staring at the torn check, his eyes wide, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Sherry was the first to react. She let out a sharp, incredulous gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. But I noticed something. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the pieces of paper. She was doing the math in her head, realizing that $40,000, money she had probably already spent in her imagination, was now gone. "You're crazy," Gary whispered. He looked up at me, shaking his head. "You are actually crazy. Who does that? Who rips up money like that?" "A mother who isn't going to be bought or bullied," I said calmly. I picked up my knife and fork and cut a small piece of roast beef, though my stomach was tied in such a tight knot I didn't know if I could swallow it. "You said I needed to learn a lesson, Gary. I'm simply showing you that I'm a quick learner." Gary slammed his hand down on the table. The silverware rattled. The wine in the glasses trembled. "Stop acting like the victim," he shouted. His voice cracked, and for a split second, I saw the little boy he used to be, frustrated, hurt, and confused. "You sit there at the head of the table, playing the saint, acting like you're so generous. But we know the truth. Sherry told me everything." I set my fork down. I turned my body fully toward him. I needed to get to the bottom of this. A son doesn't turn on his mother overnight. This hate didn't grow in a vacuum. It was planted. "What truth, Gary?" I asked. My voice was low, demanding. "What exactly did Sherry tell you?" Sherry suddenly shifted in her chair. She reached out and touched Gary's arm, her fingernails digging into his sweater. "Gary, don't," she said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "It doesn't matter. It's done. We don't need her help. Let's just go." She was trying to shut him up. She knew that if he spoke, her web of lies might unravel. But Gary was too worked up to stop. He pulled his arm away from her. He wanted to hurt me with his words. He wanted me to feel the pain he was feeling. "No, I'm going to say it," Gary snapped, glaring at me. 3 months ago, when Sherry found that lump. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Lump. I repeated. What lump? Don't pretend you don't know. Gary yelled. He stood up now, looming over the table. Sherry was terrified. The doctors wanted to do a biopsy immediately, but our insurance had a massive deductible we hadn't met. We were scared, Mom. We were broke and scared that she had cancer. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at Sherry. She was looking down at her lap, playing with her napkin, avoiding my eyes. Gary, I said, my voice trembling. I didn't know. Nobody told me. Liar. Gary screamed. Sherry called you. She called you crying. She swallowed her pride and asked you for a loan just to cover the biopsy, so we wouldn't have to wait. And do you know what she said you did? I couldn't breathe. I shook my head slowly. Gary, I never got that call. She said you laughed, Gary said, his voice dropping to a disgusted hiss. She said you told her that if she couldn't afford her own medical bills, maybe she should get a better job. She said you told her you weren't a bank. I sat frozen in my chair. The cruelty of the lie was breathtaking. It was so specific, so evil, and so perfectly designed to destroy a son's love for his mother. To think that I, the woman who had worked double shifts to pay for Gary's braces, the woman who had nursed him through every flu and fever, would laugh at a cancer scare, it was monstrous. I never said that. I whispered, Gary, look at me. You know me. Do you really believe I would do that? I didn't want to believe it. Gary said, his eyes wet with tears. But why would she lie about cancer? Mom, why would she make that up? She came home in tears. She was devastated. That's why I stopped calling. That's why we haven't been around. How could I bring her here to eat dinner with a woman who laughed at her fear? I looked at Sherry. She finally looked up, and for a second, her mask slipped. There was no fear in her eyes. There was only defiance. She dared me to call her out. She knew it was her word against mine, and she had spent the last year ensuring Gary was firmly on her side. It was a benign cyst, thank God, Sherry said softly, addressing the room but not looking at me. But we didn't know that at the time. It was a very hard week. But we got through it, Gary. We don't need her money now. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. I thought back to 3 months ago. I checked my mental calendar. I remembered calling Gary repeatedly around that time. I remembered my calls going straight to voicemail. I remembered texting him and getting short, one-word replies. Can't talk. Busy. Later. I had assumed he was busy at work. I had assumed they were just living their lives. But now I realized what had actually happened. Sherry hadn't just lied. She had intercepted. She must have deleted my voicemails. She must have blocked my number on his phone when he was in the shower or sleeping, then unblocked it later. So he wouldn't notice. She had created a wall of silence, and then she had filled that silence with poison. She had told him I was a monster, and because he loved her, because he was scared for her health, he believed her. She had used a health scare, real or exaggerated. I didn't know, as a weapon to sever the cord between mother and son. It was brilliant. It was diabolical. And it explained everything. It explained the coldness. It explained why he hadn't thanked me for the birthday card I sent. It explained why he looked at me with such disdain when he walked in the door. He didn't see his mother. He saw a villain who had abandoned his wife. I looked at Gary, standing there with his fists clenched, defending his wife's honor. And strangely, my anger toward him evaporated. I didn't feel mad at him anymore. I felt a deep, heartbreaking pity. He wasn't a bad son. He was a manipulated man. He was a puppet. And Sherry was pulling the strings so tight they were cutting off his circulation. He thought he was standing up for justice, but he was standing up for a fiction. If I argued with him now, if I screamed that Sherry was a liar, he would just dig his heels in deeper. He would see it as me attacking his victim wife again. Words wouldn't work. Denial wouldn't work. He was too far gone for that. I needed something stronger than words. I needed proof. My hand drifted to my apron pocket again. I could feel the sharp corner of the black envelope. I had hoped that the envelope contained a misunderstanding. I had hoped that maybe the private investigator I hired was wrong, or that the things he found were just coincidences. But looking at Sherry now, seeing the smugness hidden beneath her fake fragility, I knew the investigator wasn't wrong. The things in that envelope weren't just financial records. They were the keys to Gary's cage. I realized then that I couldn't save the dinner. The turkey was getting cold. The wine was warm. The holiday spirit was dead on the floor with the confetti check. I couldn't save Christmas, but maybe, just maybe, I could save my son. You're right, Gary, I said softly. Gary blinked, confused by my sudden surrender. What? I said you're right. I repeated, if I had done that, if I had laughed at Sherry's pain, that would be unforgivable. No amount of money could fix that. Exactly, Gary said, letting out a breath, looking vindicated. But I continued, my voice hardening just a fraction. There is one thing I don't understand. I turned my gaze directly to Sherry. She stiffened. She sensed the shift in the air. She knew the game had changed. If you were so desperate for money for a medical procedure, I asked Sherry, why did you take that trip to Las Vegas the very same week? Sherry's eyes went wide. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Gary frowned. What? We didn't go to Vegas. You didn't, Gary, I said, keeping my eyes locked on Sherry. But Sherry did. While you were at work. While you were supposedly worrying about a biopsy. That's a lie. Sherry shrieked. Her voice was too loud, too panicked. She's lying, Gary. She's trying to confuse you. I stood up slowly. I wasn't just a lonely old woman anymore. I was the matriarch of this family, and I was done being the villain in their twisted story. I'm not asking you to believe me, Gary. I said, I know you don't trust me right now, but I think you should trust your own eyes. I pulled the black envelope out of my pocket. It hit the table with a heavy thud right on top of the ripped check. What is that? Gary asked, his voice shaking. That, I said, is the lesson. The black envelope sat on the table between us like a loaded gun. For a moment, nobody spoke. The accusation I had just thrown out, that Sherry had gone to Las Vegas while claiming to be terrified of a biopsy, hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sherry's face had gone pale, but then, just as quickly, it flushed with a splotchy, indignant red. She let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded more like a bark. Vegas, she sputtered, looking at Gary with wide, innocent eyes. Gary, you hear her? She's delusional. She's actually losing her mind. I haven't been to Vegas since my bachelorette party. Gary looked at the envelope, then at Sherry, and finally at me. He looked torn. He wanted to believe his wife. Of course he did. He loved her. But the seed of doubt had been planted. I could see it in the way he furrowed his brow. Mom, Gary said, his voice dropping to that patronizing tone people use with toddlers and the elderly. Look, I know you're upset about the check. I know you're hurt that we didn't want your money. But making up wild stories about Sherry, that's beneath you. It's sad. Sad. I repeated. The word tasted bitter. Yes, sad. Sherry chimed in, gaining confidence now that Gary was defending her again. She sat up straighter, smoothing her napkin over her lap. She thought she was safe. She thought the Vegas comment was just a senile ramblings of an old woman, a lucky guess that she could bluff her way out of. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I didn't pound the table. Instead, I went deadly quiet. I took a sip of my wine. I let the silence stretch out until it became uncomfortable. I watched them squirm. I realized in that moment that defending myself was useless. If I said, I'm not crazy, I would sound crazy. If I said, I have proof, they would just shout over me. To catch a fox, you don't chase it. You wait. You let it think the coop is open. I set my glass down. I looked at Sherry with a calmness that I didn't feel. I softened my eyes. I let my shoulders slump just a little to look smaller, to look defeated. Maybe you're right, I said softly. Gary blinked. What? Maybe I am getting confused. I lied. Things have been foggy lately. Being in this big house all alone, sometimes the days blur together. I saw Sherry's eyes light up. It was predatory. She smelled blood in the water. She thought I was cracking. She thought I was finally admitting to being the fragile, incompetent old woman she had been painting me as to my son. Well, Sherry said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. It's completely understandable, Roseanne. Isolation does terrible things to the mind. We've been worried about you. Haven't we, Gary? Gary nodded, though he looked at his plate. Yeah, we worry, Mom. I turned my chair slightly to face Sherry directly. I kept my hand inches from the black envelope, but I didn't touch it. Not yet. Sherry, I asked, keeping my voice gentle. I want to ask you something honestly. Forget the check. Forget the lesson. Is the biopsy lie the only reason you're angry with me? Is that really why you've kept Gary away for months? Sherry hesitated. She glanced at Gary, then back at me. She licked her lips. She saw an opening to say what she had really wanted to say all night. It's not just anger, Roseanne, she said, leaning forward. It's frustration. We see you living in this fortress. It's 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, for one person. It's selfish. Selfish? I asked. Yes, she said, gaining momentum. Gary and I are struggling. We're trying to build a future. We're trying to start a family. And you're sitting on $1 million of equity, pouring money into heating rooms you don't even use. It's not safe for you here. What if you fall down those stairs? What if you slip on the ice in the driveway? She reached out and covered Gary's hand with hers. Gary is too polite to say it, but we think it's time you face reality. You're too old to live here alone. You need to sell the house. There it was. The truth. Naked and ugly. She didn't care about my health. She didn't care about my lesson. She wanted the equity. She wanted the cash. She had probably already spent the money in her head. A new house for them, a new car for her, and a cheap apartment for me. Or worse. I looked at Gary. Is that how you feel, son? Do you think I'm too old? Gary looked miserable. Mom, the market is at an all-time high. Sherry says if we sell now, we could invest the money. We could manage it for you. You wouldn't have to worry about bills anymore. We could put you somewhere smaller, safer. Manage it for me? I repeated, we're just thinking of your future. Sherry said, smiling that tight, plastic smile. And Gary's future. It's what a good mother would want, isn't it? To help her son. She thought she had won. She thought she had talked the old lady into a corner. She was practically beaming, imagining the for sale sign in the yard. I looked at her smile. I memorized it, because I knew it was the last time I would ever see it. I let out a long, slow sigh. I looked around the dining room, at the crown molding, at the fireplace, at the home I had built with my husband. You make some very strong points, Sherry. I said, it is a big house, and the market is high. Sherry squeezed Gary's hand. Exactly. We could call a realtor next week. My friend Jessica handles estates like this all the time. Actually, I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing all the fake warmth I had just feigned. I thought you might bring that up. I stopped smiling. The confused old lady act evaporated instantly. I straightened my back. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I thought you might try to convince Gary that I was incompetent. I said, I thought you might try to get your hands on this house. Sherry's smile faltered. Excuse me? I reached out and placed my hand flat on the black envelope. That's why I have this, I said. I tapped the envelope with my index finger. The sound was like a gavel hitting a podium. You see, Sherry, I'm not confused. I'm not senile. And I'm certainly not helpless. I locked eyes with her. I knew you were coming for my house. I just needed you to admit it out loud, so Gary could hear it. Mom, what is going on? Gary asked, panic rising in his voice. What is in that envelope? The reason you're really here, Gary, I said, and the reason your wife is suddenly so interested in my safety. I flipped the envelope open. I didn't rush. I wanted them to see every movement. I reached inside and pulled out a stack of papers. They were clipped together, photos, bank statements, and printouts of text messages. Sherry mentioned her friend Jessica. The realtor, I said, holding up a stapled packet of papers. Funny she should mention that name, because I have the text messages she sent to Jessica last week. Sherry's face went white, a dead, ghostly white. She stood up so fast her chair screeched against the hardwood floor. Don't, she warned. Her voice wasn't sweet anymore. It was a growl. Roseanne, don't you dare. I ignored her. I looked at my son. You want to know about my future, Gary? You want to know where Sherry plans on putting me once she sells this house? I pulled out a glossy brochure from the middle of the stack and slid it across the table toward him. She doesn't want me in a smaller, safer apartment, I said. She wants me here. I watched Gary's hand tremble as he reached for the brochure I had slid across the mahogany table. It wasn't a glossy, high-end pamphlet for one of those retirement communities with swimming pools and bridge clubs. It was a flimsy single-fold paper for a place called Pineview State Care Facility. Gary picked it up, squinting at the grainy photo on the front. It showed a drab brick building with barred windows on the ground floor and a patch of brown grass out front. It looked more like a holding cell than a home. Pineview. Gary read the name out loud, his brow furrowing in confusion. I don't understand. What is this? It's a state-run facility, Gary, I said, keeping my voice even, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. It's where the state puts seniors who have no assets, no family support, and nowhere else to go. It's known for two things, being incredibly cheap and being under investigation for neglect. Sherry made a noise in the back of her throat, like a trapped animal. That's just one of the options Jessica sent over, she stammered, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit. We were just gathering information. We want the best for you, Roseanne. That brochure probably just got mixed in with the others. There were no others, Sherry, I said, cutting her off. I saw the email thread. You specifically asked the realtor for the lowest cost facility within a 50-mile radius that accepts Medicaid waivers. You weren't looking for a home for me. You were looking for a warehouse. Gary looked up from the brochure, his face pale. Sherry, you told me we were looking at those condos near the park. You said we were going to build an in-law suite with the proceeds from the house sale. We were. Sherry cried, grabbing his arm. Gary, she's twisting everything. I just wanted to have a backup plan in case the money ran out. In case the money ran out. I repeated. I reached into the black envelope again. That brings me to the next part of the lesson. I pulled out a stack of stapled bank statements. I knew these would hurt him more than the brochure. The brochure was a threat to me. The bank statements were a betrayal of him. You told me earlier that you were drowning in debt, Gary, I said, placing the papers in front of him. You said you needed my help because you were working double shifts and still couldn't make ends meet. I believed you. That's why I wrote that check. Gary looked down at the papers. They weren't his bank statements. They were for an account he didn't know existed. "What is this?" he whispered. "That is a savings account in Sherry's name," I explained. "Look at the deposits, Gary. Look at the dates." He ran his finger down the column of numbers. October 12th, $2,000. November 1st, $1,500. November 15th, $3,000. He looked up, his eyes wide with shock. "These dates, these are my paydays. This is my overtime money." "Exactly," I said. "You were working yourself into an early grave, picking up extra shifts, thinking you were paying down debt. But you weren't. Sherry was siphoning that money into her private account. And look at the withdrawals." I pointed to the next page. "See that charge for the Venetian in Las Vegas? That was the week she supposedly had the biopsy. While you were sitting at home, sick with worry that your wife had cancer, she was sitting at a blackjack table spending your hard-earned money." Gary looked at Sherry. He looked like a man who had just been punched in the gut. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just held up the statement, shaking it slightly, demanding a silent explanation. Sherry's face twisted. The sweet, concerned daughter-in-law mask was gone. In its place was something ugly and desperate. "I earned that money," she shrieked. "I manage this household. I deserve a break. You have no idea how stressful it is dealing with your family." "You stole from me," Gary said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was eating instant noodles for lunch because you said we were broke. I sold my golf clubs because you said we couldn't make rent. It's our money." Sherry yelled. "It was his life," I interjected, my voice sharp. "But stealing his money wasn't enough for you, was it? You wanted the jackpot. You wanted my house." I reached into the envelope for the final item. This was the one that had kept me awake for 3 nights straight. This was the one that made me hire the security guard to watch my house when I slept. "The money is bad, Gary," I said, my voice softening as I looked at my son. "But this is why I couldn't let you leave tonight without knowing the truth." I laid a sheet of printed text messages on top of the bank statements. They were screenshots from Sherry's phone. My private investigator had done a thorough job. "Sherry told you that I needed to sell the house because I was too old and it was unsafe," I said. "She told you it was for my own good. But that's not what she told her friend Jessica." Gary looked down at the paper. The text messages were highlighted in yellow. "Read the one from last Tuesday." I instructed him. "Read it out loud, Gary." Gary swallowed hard. He wiped sweat from his upper lip. He leaned in, his eyes scanning the page. I saw his jaw tighten. I saw the blood drain completely from his face until he looked like a ghost. "Read it," I commanded softly. Gary's voice shook as he began to read. "Don't worry about the old lady. I've already started the paperwork for a competency hearing. We'll tell the judge she's forgetting things, leaving the stove on. Once she's declared incompetent, I get power of attorney." He stopped. He couldn't finish. He looked up at me, tears welling in his eyes. "Mom." "Keep reading," I said. "The next line." He looked back at the paper. He took a ragged breath. "The old hag will be out by January, and we'll be rich. The house is worth $1 million, easy. We can dump her at Pineview and be in Cabo by February." The silence that followed was deafening. "The old hag," I repeated the words, tasting the venom in them. "That's what I am to her, Gary. Not your mother. Not a human being. Just an obstacle. A hurdle she had to jump over to get to her vacation in Cabo." Sherry stood up. Her chair fell backward with a loud crash. She wasn't crying. She wasn't apologizing. She was glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You violated my privacy," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me. "That's illegal. You can't use those. I'll sue you. You were plotting to have me committed." I shot back, standing up to meet her gaze. You were going to stand in front of a judge and lie about my mind. You were going to strip me of my rights, my dignity, and my home just so you could buy a beach house. I turned to Gary. He was still staring at the paper, reading that line over and over again. The old hag will be out by January. She wasn't trying to help me, son, I said gently. She was trying to erase me. Gary slowly stood up. He didn't look at me. He turned his body toward Sherry. He looked at the woman he had married, the woman he had defended against his own mother just an hour ago. He looked at the designer purse I had given her sitting on the floor. He looked at the ripped check on the table. And then he looked at the brochure for the Pineview State Care Facility. You were going to put my mother in a cage. Gary asked. His voice was terrifyingly quiet. Gary, baby, it was just talk. Sherry pleaded, reaching for him. I was just venting to Jessica. You know how I get. I would never actually do it. You opened a secret bank account, Gary said, stepping back from her touch. You went to Vegas while I was crying over your biopsy results. And you talked about my mother like she was garbage. He crumpled the paper in his fist. I think I'm going to be sick, Gary said. That makes two of us, I said, sitting back down. But we're not done yet. There is one last thing you need to know. The dining room felt suffocating. Sherry was cornered, and like any cornered animal, she lashed out. She didn't look remorseful. She looked furious that her perfect plan had been dismantled by an old lady. This is ridiculous, Sherry shouted, waving her hand at the papers scattered on the table. She turned desperately to Gary, grabbing his shoulders with both hands, trying to force him to look at her. Gary, baby, listen to me. You can't actually believe this. She typed these up herself. Look at her. She spent all day plotting against me. Gary didn't move. He stood rigid, like a statue, staring at the crumpled piece of paper in his fist, the text message where his wife had called his mother an old hag. It's not fake, Sherry, Gary said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. This is your number. This is your profile picture. And this. He held up the bank statement with the Las Vegas charge. This has the transaction ID. You can't fake that. I can explain the Vegas charge. Sherry stammered, her eyes wild. It was an investment. I was networking. For us, Gary. For our future. I was trying to find opportunities, so we wouldn't have to live paycheck to paycheck. By gambling? Gary asked, finally looking at her. His eyes were red, filled with a mixture of heartbreak and disgust. You told me you were at home, crying in bed, waiting for a doctor to call. I took 3 days off work, unpaid, to sit by the phone with you. But you weren't even in the state. I was stressed. Sherry shrieked. I needed an escape. You don't understand the pressure I'm under dealing with your debt. Your mother? My mother? Gary interrupted, his voice rising. He pulled away from her grip and stepped back. He picked up the nursing home brochure again. You want to talk about my mother? You were going to lock her away in this. He threw the brochure at her. It hit her in the chest and fluttered to the floor. Pineview? Gary shouted. I drove past that place last year. It looks like a prison. You were going to put the woman who raised me in a place like that just so you could go to Cabo. Sherry looked at the brochure on the floor, then back at Gary. She realized the misunderstanding angle wasn't working. So she switched tactics. She switched to cruelty. Oh, grow up, Gary, she snapped, her face twisting into a sneer. Someone had to be the adult here. Your mother is useless. Look at her. She sits in this giant house all day, doing nothing while we scrape by. She owes us. She's had her turn. Why should she live like a queen while we suffer? It's not fair. She worked for 40 years. Gary yelled back. She saved that money. It's hers. It should be ours. Sherry screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. We are the future. She's just waiting to die. Why let the money rot with her? The room went silent. Gary looked at his wife as if he had never seen her before. The mask was completely off now. The beautiful, supportive woman he thought he married was gone. In her place was a greedy, hateful stranger who saw people as dollar signs. I watched it all from the head of the table. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I had laid out the truth. And now the truth was doing the work for me. I picked up my teacup. The tea was cold now, but I didn't care and took a slow sip. I watched Sherry unravel. She was pacing back and forth, ranting now, trying to justify her greed. She was listing all the things she deserved, all the sacrifices she claimed she made. She sounded insane. And I watched my son break. Gary sank into his chair. He put his head in his hands. His shoulders started to shake. It started as a small tremor, but then a sob ripped through him. It was a guttural, painful sound. The sound of a man realizing his entire life for the last 2 years had been a lie. He realized he had bullied his mother for a monster. He realized he had ignored my calls, skipped holidays, and treated me like a burden, all because he believed the woman who was currently screaming about resale value. I'm sorry, Gary choked out through his hands. Mom, God, I am so sorry. Sherry stopped pacing. She looked at Gary, disgusted by his tears. Oh, stop crying. You're pathetic. This is exactly why we never get ahead. You're a mama's boy. Gary slowly lifted his head. He wiped his face with his sleeve. He looked at me. His eyes were pleading for forgiveness, but I didn't move to comfort him, yet. He needed to feel this. He needed to feel the weight of his choices. I'm not a mama's boy, Sherry, Gary said quietly. He stood up again. This time, he stood taller. I'm a man who just realized he's been sleeping next to a snake. Excuse me? Sherry gasped. You're a liar, Gary said, walking toward her. You're a thief. And you are cruel. I could forgive the money. Maybe. But what you plan to do to my mother. He pointed a shaking finger at the nursing home brochure on the floor. That is evil. That is straight up evil. I did it for us. Sherry yelled. There is no us anymore, Gary said. Sherry froze. Her mouth opened and closed. What? You can't mean that. Gary, don't be dramatic. We're married. Not for long, Gary said. The words hung in the air, final and absolute. I set my teacup down on the saucer with a soft clink. It was the only sound in the room. Sherry looked at me. Her eyes narrowed. She knew I had won. She knew that the old hag she planned to discard had just outsmarted her without raising her voice. You did this, she hissed at me. You planned this whole thing. You witch. I looked at her calmly. I didn't flinch. I didn't frown. I just smoothed the napkin on my lap. I didn't do anything, Sherry. I said softly, I just opened the mail. Sherry let out a scream of frustration. She grabbed her purse, the old one, not the new designer one I had bought her, and turned to Gary. Fine, she yelled. I'm leaving. If you want to stay here with this dinosaur, then go ahead. But don't come crawling back to me when she dies and leaves you with nothing. She stormed toward the hallway. We heard the heavy front door slam, so hard the windows rattled. Then silence. Real silence. Gary stood in the middle of the room, alone. The confetti of the ripped check was on the table. The bank statements were scattered on the floor. The Christmas dinner was cold. He looked at me, tears streaming down his face again. He looked like he wanted to run to me, to hide in my arms like he did when he was 5 years old. But he knew he couldn't. He knew he had broken something that couldn't be fixed with a hug. Mom, he whispered. I don't know what to say. I looked at him. I loved him. He was my son. but I was also a woman who had just saved her own life. Sit down, Gary, I said, gesturing to his chair. We're not finished. There's more, he asked, terrified. Yes, I said. Sherry is gone, but you and I still have business to discuss. I reached for the last document in the envelope, the one I hadn't shown yet, the one that would ensure I never had to worry about a nursing home plot ever again. You see, Gary, I said, Sherry was right about one thing. I am old, and I do need to protect my future. I placed the document on the table, and now that I know what you're capable of when you're influenced by the wrong person, I need to protect myself from you, too. The silence in the dining room didn't last long. From the hallway, we heard the front door open again. Sherry hadn't left. Of course she hadn't. Manipulators never leave until they are sure they have extracted every last ounce of value from their victims. She was standing in the open doorway, letting the freezing winter air blast into the house. Gary, she screamed from the foyer. Her voice echoed down the hall, shrill and demanding. I am starting the car. You have exactly 1 minute to get your coat and get in, or I am driving back to the city and changing the locks. Gary flinched. It was a reflex, a conditioned response after years of walking on eggshells. He looked at the hallway, then he looked at me. He looked like a man waking up from a long, bad dream, unsure of what was real and what was a nightmare. I stayed seated. I didn't tell him what to do. This was the moment that would define the rest of his life, and he had to make the choice on his own. Go to her if you want, Gary, I said quietly. If you think she loves you, if you think that nursing home brochure was a mistake, then go. I won't stop you. I paused, taking a breath. But know this, if you walk out that door with her tonight, you don't come back. Not for Christmas. Not for my funeral. Never. Gary looked at me. His eyes were red and swollen, but the fog was clearing. He looked down at the documents on the table one last time. The bank statements showing the stolen money, the text messages calling me an old hag. He took a deep breath. His shoulders straightened. I'm not going anywhere, he whispered. He stood up. He didn't walk toward the coat rack. Instead, he walked over to where Sherry had been sitting. He bent down and picked up the red gift bag containing the designer purse I had bought for her, the peace offering she had sneered at. He held the bag in his hand, feeling the weight of it. Then, he turned and walked toward the hallway. I followed him, stopping at the edge of the living room to watch. Sherry was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. When she saw Gary walking toward her, she smirked. She thought she had won. She thought he was coming to apologize and obey, just like he always did. Finally, she huffed. Let's go. I can't believe you made me wait in the cold. We are never coming back to this dump. Gary stopped 3 feet away from her. He didn't put his coat on. He looked her right in the eye. You're right, Gary said. His voice was steady, louder than I had heard it all night. We are never coming back here. I am staying. You are leaving. Sherry's smirk vanished. Excuse me? I want you out, Gary said. I want you out of this house. I want you out of my apartment. And I want you out of my bank accounts. You can't do that. Sherry shrieked, stepping into the foyer. We're married. You can't just kick me out on Christmas Eve. Watch me, Gary said. He lifted the red gift bag. And take this with you. Mom paid for it. It's the only thing you're getting from this family. He tossed the bag. He didn't throw it violently. He just tossed it underhand. It sailed through the air and landed in the snow on the porch, right next to her boots. Get out, Sherry, Gary said, before I call the police and show them the bank statements. Sherry looked at the bag in the snow. She looked at Gary's face, which was hard as stone. She realized, finally, that her grip on him was broken. She let out a scream of pure rage, a sound that wasn't human. She turned, grabbed the door handle, and slammed it shut in his face. We stood there for a moment, listening. We heard her boots crunching in the snow. We heard her car door slam. We heard the engine rev and tires spinning on the ice as she peeled out of the driveway. Then silence returned. But this time it was a peaceful silence. Gary slumped against the doorframe. He slid down until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. He looked exhausted, like he had just run a marathon. "I'm sorry, Mom," he sobbed quietly. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I was so stupid." I walked over and offered him a hand. "Come on, get up. The floor is cold." We walked back into the dining room. Gary sat down, looking at the mess on the table. He looked at me with puppy dog eyes, expecting me to hug him, to tell him everything was okay, to tell him that we could go back to normal now that the witch was gone. But I sat back down in my chair at the head of the table. I wasn't done. "It's good that you sent her away, Gary," I said, keeping my tone businesslike. "But that doesn't fix the problem." Gary wiped his nose. "I know. I have to file for divorce. I have to fix the money. I'll pay you back, Mom. I swear. Every penny she stole." "I know you will," I said, "but that's not what I'm talking about." I reached for the final document that I had placed on the table earlier, the one I hadn't explained yet. "You see, Gary," I began smoothing the paper out. "I love you. You are my only son. But tonight, I saw something that scared me more than Sherry." "What?" Gary asked. "I saw how easily you were led." I said bluntly, "I saw how quickly you turned on me because someone whispered a lie in your ear. You let a wolf into the hen house, Gary, and you held the door open for her." Gary looked down, ashamed. "I know. I was weak." "Yes, you were," I said. "And because you were weak, you almost cost me my home. You almost put me in a state facility." I tapped the document on the table. "That is why I signed this morning," I said. "This is an irrevocable trust." Gary frowned. "A trust? What does that mean?" "It means that as of 9 a.m. this morning, I do not own this house anymore." I explained. "The trust owns it, and the trust has very specific rules." I looked him dead in the eye. "This house cannot be sold while I am alive," I said, "and more importantly, it cannot be sold for 10 years after I die. It stays in the family. It provides a roof, but it cannot provide cash." Gary's mouth opened slightly. "Mom, why?" "To protect it from Sherry," I said, "and to protect it from you." The color drained from his face again. "If something happens to me tomorrow, Gary," I continued, "you can live here. You can raise a family here. But you cannot sell it. You cannot cash out the equity to pay off gambling debts or to buy a fancy car or to please a new wife who thinks the furniture is dated." "You don't trust me?" Gary whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. "I trust your heart," I said honestly, "but I don't trust your judgment. Not right now. You have to earn that back." I stood up and began to clear the plates. The dinner was ruined, but my future was safe. "You have a bed here tonight, Gary," I said, stacking the china. "But don't think for a second that things go back to normal just because you threw a purse in the snow. You lost my trust, and that is much harder to earn than money." Gary sat there, looking at the document. He realized that while he had lost a wife, he hadn't fully regained a mother. He had regained a landlord, and for the first time in his life, he was going to have to grow up. "Lesson learned," he whispered, repeating the words I had said earlier. "Good," I said, walking to the kitchen. "Now, help me with the dishes." The calendar on my kitchen wall says January 24th. It has been exactly 1 month since Christmas Eve. 1 month since the check was ripped, the purse was thrown in the snow, and the black envelope changed everything. The house is quiet today, but it's a good kind of quiet. It's not the lonely silence Sherry tried to convince me I was drowning in. It's the peaceful silence of a home that is safe. This morning, I had my friends Martha and Joyce over for coffee. We sat in the living room, the same room Sherry called dated, and we laughed until our sides hurt. We talked about our gardens, our book club, and yes, we talked about our children. But for the first time in 2 years, I didn't have to lie. I didn't have to pretend Gary was calling me when he wasn't. I didn't have to make excuses for why I wasn't invited to holidays. I told them the truth. I told them my son was starting over, and I told them I was proud of him, not because he's rich. He certainly isn't anymore, but because he's finally free. Around noon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. It wasn't a luxury SUV this time. It was a beat-up Honda Civic that Gary had bought off Craigslist last week. I watched him walk up the path. He looked different. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his coat was a little worn, but he walked with his head up. He didn't look like a puppet anymore. He looked like a man. He knocked on the door. He didn't just barge in, assuming he owned the place. He waited. When I opened the door, the cold January air rushed in, but Gary's smile was warm. "Hi, Mom," he said. "I brought you something." He held out a small, white bakery box. "Donuts?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Bear claws," he smiled. "Your favorite. I remembered you used to get them for us on Saturday mornings." It was a $3 box of pastries. It wasn't a designer purse. It wasn't a grand gesture. But it was the best gift I had received in years because he had remembered me. He hadn't asked Sherry what to buy. He had looked into his own memory and found something that mattered. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the war had happened a month ago. We ate the bear claws and drank coffee. "How is the apartment?" I asked. "It's small," Gary admitted, wiping a crumb from his lip. "It's a studio over on 4th Street. The radiator clanks, and I'm sleeping on a mattress on the floor until I can afford a bed frame. But it's quiet. Nobody is screaming at me about money. Nobody is checking my bank account every 5 minutes. And the divorce? Messy," he sighed. "Sherry is fighting for everything, even though there's nothing left to take. She's furious about the trust." I nodded. "Good. She tried to tell her lawyer that you coerced me," Gary said. "But I showed them the text messages, the ones from the black envelope. Her lawyer went pretty quiet after that." He reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm. His hands were rougher than they used to be. He was picking up extra shifts at the warehouse again, but they were honest hands. "I wanted to thank you, Mom," he said softly. "For the donuts." I teased. "No," he said, his eyes serious. "For ripping up that check. And for showing me the truth. If you had just given me the money, if you had just been nice, I would be in Cabo right now, and you would be packing for Pineview. You saved my life, Mom. And you saved your own." I squeezed his hand back. "I just did what a mother has to do, Gary." He stayed for another hour. He fixed the loose hinge on the back door that had been bothering me for months. He shoveled the walk without me asking. And when he left, he didn't ask for a loan. He didn't ask about the will. He just hugged me tight and said, "See you Sunday." After he left, I stood by the window and watched him drive away in his rusty little car. I thought about the black envelope. It was still in my desk drawer, filed away. I hoped I would never have to open it again. But I knew that if I had been too afraid to use it, if I had been too afraid of rocking the boat or losing Gary's love, I would have lost everything. We spend our whole lives trying to protect our children from the world. We bandage their scraped knees. We help them with their homework. But the hardest lesson I ever learned was that sometimes you have to protect your children from themselves. And sometimes the only way to save the relationship is to be brave enough to risk destroying it with the truth. I'm Roseanne Walker. I'm 70 years old. I live in a big, beautiful house in Boulder, Colorado. My furniture is dated, my china is old, and my son drives a junk car. And I have never been happier. What about you? Have you ever had a feeling in your gut that someone in your family wasn't who they claimed to be? Have you ever had to choose between being nice and being right? Would you have been brave enough to open the black envelope? Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story.